Part 9, The Law of Logical Deduction. You are now invited to consider that important law of logical reasoning known as the Law of Logical Deduction. This law represents the universal experience of human thought, rationally applied and directed. The law of logical deduction is expressed in the seventh of the 7 axioms of logical reasoning, which is as follows. 7. Axiom of logical deduction: what is true of the class as a whole, must be true of each, every and all the individuals composing that class. The principle, law and truth embodied in this axiom is employed in all logical reasoning. It is regarded as self-evident truth, properly to be taken for granted. It is assumed in all logical thought, and is implied in all true reasoning. The law of logical deduction from the earliest times has been recognized and employed in logical reasoning. In fact, until the rise into favor of inductive reasoning, the logicians held that deduction was the only valid form of logical inference. At present, it is clearly perceived that inasmuch as the material for all deduction must be furnished ready-made by induction, and inasmuch as induction must be verified by subsequent deduction, consequently, these two great forms of logical reasoning cannot be divorced one from the other. Some ardent advocates of inductive reasoning, in fact, go so far as to claim that deduction is really nothing more or less than a method of making practical application of the results of induction, and that the conclusions reached by deduction have been previously implicitly asserted in the judgments passed upon the individual objects when they are admitted into their respective logical classes. We shall, however, not enter here into such technical discussion, particularly as we believe that in this, as in most cases, the truth is to be found in the middle course between the two extremes. Deduction is the logical process whereby we deduce by inference an unknown particular truth from two already known general truths. As has been said by an eminent logician, it is getting some knowledge from other knowledge. Again, it has been stated as finding out what is true if certain other things are true. Examples of deduction follow. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. All horses are animals. This creature is a horse, therefore this creature is an animal. All magnets attract steel. This piece of steel is a magnet, therefore this piece of steel will attract other steel. All mushrooms are good to eat. This fungus is a mushroom, therefore this fungus is good to eat. No fish is a warm-blooded mammal. The whale is a warm-blooded mammal, therefore the whale is not a fish. Allah is B. This thing is an A, therefore this thing is B. In the above he has stated examples you find that there are two already known facts, two propositions, two judgments. These are called the premises. There is also a third fact, a newly discovered fact, a third judgment. This is called the conclusion, or deduced judgment. A premise is a proposition antecedently supposed or proved, from two of which a conclusion is drawn by deductive inference. The most general of the two premises is known as the major premise, the less general is known as the minor premise. For instance, in the classical illustration, the major premise is, all men are mortal. The minor premise is Socrates is a man. The conclusion is Socrates is mortal. The syllogism. To the average student, one of the most forbidding things revealed in formal logic is that bearing the unfamiliar name of the syllogism. The name itself seems to suggest terrifying possibilities in the form of technicalities and academic hair-splitting, and a cursory examination of the distinction between the manifold forms of the syllogism is calculated to add to this feeling of apprehension. But, really, the only difficult feature of the syllogism, in its simpler forms, at least, is its name. As a matter of fact, you use syllogism every day in your ordinary thinking, and have always done so, though perhaps you have not realized the fact. A syllogism is simply the regular logical form of every logical argument or process of deductive reasoning. Each of the examples given above to illustrate the principle of deduction is a syllogism. The classical example is, all men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. Each syllogism consists of three elements, viz., the major premise, the minor premise, and the conclusion. The major premise contains the most universal term. In the above example, this is mortal. The minor premise contains the most particular term. In the above example, this is Socrates. The conclusion contains the most particular term as its subject, and the most universal term as its predicate, as, for instance, Socrates is mortal. There is also a middle term which does not appear in the conclusion, but which appears in the minor premise and the major premise. In the above example, the middle term is man, or men. The major premise of a syllogism has been previously arrived at by means of induction. The minor premise is the result of previous induction or deduction, as the case may be. The conclusion is the judgment obtained by the present process of deduction. The three elements of the syllogism are known as propositions. A proposition is a judgment between two concepts, formally expressed in words. You may think that the idea of the syllogism is purely technical and artificial, having nothing to do with plain, practical everyday thinking, but if so, you are mistaken. You employ the syllogism constantly when you think in the form of reasoning, argument, or decision, though you employ it more or less unconsciously. When you see a wasp moving toward you, you seem to say to yourself merely, "I must look out for that wasp," but your mind really is thinking, though for the most part more or less unconsciously, "All wasps sting, that insect is a wasp, therefore, that insect stings." If it were not for your previously acquired knowledge of your major premise, i.e., all wasps sting, and of your minor premise, i.e., that insect is a wasp, you would not be able to arrive at your, more or less unconscious, conclusion, i.e., that insect stings, which, in turn arouses your desire and will to look out for that wasp. You follow the same general course when you move away from the place at which you hear the rattlesnake's warning. You follow it when you retreat rapidly from the presence of the skunk, though you do not stop to analyze your thought into its elements, or to translate it into words. You follow it when you gently lay down the stick of strange-looking substance when someone calls out to you, "Look out, that is dynamite." You use it when you know that a particular pauper pays no taxes, though your mind only unconsciously goes through the thinking stages of "he is a pauper, paupers do not pay taxes, therefore, he does not pay taxes." In short, you employ it, though more or less unconsciously, in every thinking process of deduction, by means of which a decision, or judgment is reached. If you will take the trouble to analyze any thought leading up to a deductive judgment, you will find that each step or stage of the syllogism has been employed. But, here is an important point: in ordinary thought and deductive thinking, there is a slurring, suppression, or omission from conscious thought of one or more of the three respective propositions composing the syllogism. The missing proposition, however, still exists in the mind of the thinker in his subconscious or unconscious fields of mentation. They are always taken for granted or implied, even though one may not be conscious of their presence. When you analyze even the most informal argument, or simplest deductive inference, you will find that the missing elements are always there in the mind. Logicians apply to the results of this slurring or leaving out process the term, enthymeme, meaning, in the mind. You are not required to remember this name, however. You may think of it simply as a shortcut syllogism, for that is exactly what it is. Shortcut syllogisms vary greatly in particular form, but are reducible to three general classes. Here follow examples of each of the three classes. With major premise omitted: "We are a free people, therefore, we are happy." Here the major premise, i.e., all free people are happy, is unexpressed, though existing in the mind. With minor premise omitted: "Poets are imaginative, therefore, Byron was imaginative." Here the minor premise, i.e., Byron was a poet, is unexpressed, though existing in the mind. With conclusion omitted: "All braggarts are cowards, Bombasts is a braggart." Here the conclusion, i.e., therefore, Bombasts is a coward, is unexpressed, though existing in the mind, and also probably intended to be called into the mind of the listener or reader. This last form is often employed very effectively in debate or public speaking. The Frenchman's characteristic shrug of the shoulders is really a syllogistic shortcut, in which the conclusion is unexpressed in words, though existing in the mind and suggested by the gesture. Also, when you say, "I allow you to draw your own conclusion," you are employing this form of shortcut often quite effectively. You will find it excellent mental exercise and practice to restore a shortcut syllogism to its original and complete form. Stanley Williams says, "It is one of the finest exercises of the mind that it is possible to employ an exercise superior even to geometry and other branches of mathematics, because in it we are dealing with the practical everyday inference of our reason. Such practice will enable you readily to detect fundamental fallacies advanced in the reasoning or arguments of other persons. As an illustrative example of this form of practice we offer the following: this thing will sink in water, for it is a stone. Restored to syllogistic form, it is, all stones sink in water. This thing is a stone, therefore, this thing will sink in water. The textbooks of formal logic will give you a terrifying list of the numerous forms of propositions and syllogisms. This list frequently discourages the practical man, and drives him away from a further investigation of the subject. But inasmuch as all of such forms may be reduced to the few simple forms referred to by us in this section of this book, and inasmuch as the technical distinctions are of very little real practical value to the person who desires merely to become familiar with the working principles of practical logic, we shall omit further reference to them here. In addition, the textbooks of formal logic present a number of highly technical rules which govern the logical forms of the syllogism. These also we shall omit. With the aid of common sense, and a knowledge of the fundamental principles of practical logic, one may easily dispense with these hair-splitting distinctions. There are, however, several basic rules under which deductive reasoning must proceed in order to be valid, and which if violated result in fallacy or falsy reasoning, thus becoming sophistry when deliberately employed to deceive others or oneself. These basic rules we now ask you to consider. They are as follows: I. The terms must be unequivocal, and not ambiguous. 2. The premises must represent actual facts. 3. Particular terms must not be employed as universal terms. 4. The conclusion must contain nothing which is not involved in the premises. You are now invited to consider carefully the following more detailed statements concerning each of the above stated general rules of deductive reasoning, together with examples illustrating each rule. I. The terms must be unequivocal, and not ambiguous. I.e., they must be clear, plain, and not employed in more than one meaning or sense. This, because the same term, employed in the same argument in more than one of its meanings, practically becomes two terms, or more. In such case, one premise may contain the term employed in one sense, while in the other premise the same term may be employed in another sense, which would result in false reasoning and absurd conclusions. This was a favorite device of the ancient sophists. It is employed frequently, in more or less involved and disguised form, by many sophistical speakers and writers of our own time and lands. Here is a classical illustration. A man says, I am lying if he is lying, he is telling the truth if he is telling the truth, he is lying. Other examples of fallacy arising from a violation of this rule follow. Feathers are light, light is contrary to darkness, therefore, feathers are contrary to darkness. No courageous thing flies, all eagles fly, therefore, eagles are not courageous. All artists design, all designing persons are untrustworthy, therefore, all artists are untrustworthy. Vice ran in the family, the police ran in the family, therefore, the police were vicious. No cat has two tails, every cat has one more tail than no cat, therefore, every cat has three, i.e., one more than two, tails. One form of this fallacy consists in placing the mental or verbal accent or stress upon the wrong term, as for example, thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor. All that is not against thy neighbor is for him, therefore, thou shalt bear false witness for thy neighbor. The above examples, in more complex and subtle form, illustrate the favorite devices of certain sophistical reasoners, debaters and teachers. Another variety of this form of fallacy consists of the use of the words all or similar terms, in one place as a collective term, denoting a combined and united whole, and in another place as a singular term, denoting any, each, or every single individual or object forming a part of a whole. Example: the statement that, any man can carry away all the sticks in this pile, meaning to carry away all the sticks singly, one by one, is far different from the assertion that any man can carry away all such sticks at once, in a single load. Likewise, the statement that no man can carry away all the sticks in this pile, meaning to carry them away in a single load, is far different from saying that no man could carry away all of them, one by one. This form of fallacy is far more common than you might imagine from the above stated simple examples. It becomes more dangerous when expressed in more complex and involved form. Another variety of the same form consists in confusing the meaning of a grammatical phrase. Example: the animals walked in by at 2 and 2 make 4, therefore, the animals walked in by force. You have said that what you bought in the market yesterday, you ate today. You bought raw meat in the market yesterday, therefore, you ate raw meat today. You have said that it is not true that virtue consists of utility. If this be true, then virtue lacks utility, therefore, you hold that utility is a thing lacking in virtue. Patriotism is the last rest of a scoundrel, therefore, every patriot is a scoundrel. Such sophistical quibbles and tricks distinguish shyster lawyers, smart aleck debaters, and others of their kind. They are beneath contempt when employed in argument with serious intent, and they are so employed far oftener than you might suspect. Did you ever hear of the shyster who asked the witness under cross-examination the question, "Have you quit beating your wife?" and insisted upon a yes or no answer? The man had never beaten his wife. Imagine his dilemma. Another variety of the same class of fallacy is that in which the principles of a general law are sought to be applied to a particular case in which the circumstances are entirely different. Example: all who kill are murderers. Soldiers kill, therefore, soldiers are murderers. This sophistry is discovered when one refers to the definition of murder, which is illegally killing a human being with malice aforethought. Yet public men of a certain type have sought persistently to perpetrate this sophistry, and thus to influence the public mind in certain directions. Once more, the sophistry that, in Aesop's fable, the fast hare was beaten by the slow tortoise. Of the two horses entered in this race, one is fast, the other slow, therefore, the slow horse should win this race. Here, of course, Aesop's tortoise won in spite of its slowness, not because of it. 2. The premises must represent actual facts, i.e., they must represent facts derived from one's own careful observation and experiment, or from his own logical reasoning, or else from carefully considered and accepted reports of the experiences, observations, or reasoning of others deemed to be capable and in a position to observe, experiment, or reason carefully and correctly, and to judge with logical precision. The importance of this rule becomes apparent when one realizes the truth of the ancient aphorism: one can prove anything whatsoever, if he be permitted to assume certain premises. This, without violating a single technical rule of deduction. Admitting the premises of an argument or process of reasoning, the conclusion proceeds certainly, inevitably and invariably to a logical conclusion, without regard to the actual truth of the premises so employed. But, remember always, that a logical conclusion is never truer than are the premises from which it is deduced, even though the processes of reasoning or argument be logically perfect. If you start with the major premise that, all white is black, you may reason with absolute logical correctness to the conclusion that, this is black snow. Your premises must represent correct observation, experiment, and the experience of yourself, or of others deemed to be competent authorities. Your own experience must be subjected to logical inspection, and must bear the test of logical induction and deduction. The evidence of other persons must be subjected to logical and critical inspection and judgment. The two main factors determining the degree of the validity of this last mentioned class of evidence are as follows: 1. Ability, and 2. Veracity. But alas! Such associated virtues are rare. For some able men lack veracity, and many veracious men lack ability to observe, reason, and judge. Many a good man and true lacks critical perception and logical judgment. Such a man is particularly dangerous, because his virtue is apt to be mistaken for the ability which he really lacks. Again, a man may be very able in his own particular line of thought and work, but still like a child or a dunce in certain other lines. The man recognized as an authority in one line may be an ignoramus in another line. Of failure to perceive this has led astray public opinion and personal belief in very many cases, some of which may have come under your own observation. The authority, to be valid, must be real and not merely assumed. Common sense must be employed in deciding upon the validity of the opinions of claimed authorities. The authority should be subjected to the test. Question: how do you know you are justified in being from Missouri in this respect? Fallacy of begging the question: this is quite common, and it frequently deceives even careful persons whose attention has not been directed to the logical principle violated in it. It consists of assuming, taking for granted, or asking others to do so, a premise, usually a major premise, which is not based upon logical reasoning or upon actual human experience and judgment. It is true that all reasoning or argument must begin with the proposition not actually proved at the time, and which is to be taken for granted as representing valid human experience and judgment, something which is assumed to be self-evident, and requiring no further proof or demonstration. Otherwise, the reasoning process would be like running back along the links of an endless chain. One must begin somewhere. But such self-evident truth must really be one based on universal human experience, a well-verified hypothesis, or a valid logical deduction. From these a mere assumption or claim will not answer. Likewise, it is illogical and contrary to common sense to hold that a proposition or premise must be accepted as true and valid until it is actually disproved. The contrary is true. The rule is that the burden of proof lies upon the person advancing the proposition. He who affirms must prove, if called upon to do so. A favorite device of some debaters, writers of a certain type, and some persons engaged in argument, is to shift the burden of proof, and to hold that unless the proposition is disproved it must be admitted to the argument. The absolute rule is, the proposition must be positively proved. If demanded, no mere negative failure to disprove it can constitute or serve as positive proof of the proposition. The fallacy of begging the question is a very common and, often a very dangerous one. It appears in many forms, and under many disguises. It is particularly dangerous, because especially insidious, when it appears in disguised form in the major premise. Here the formal conclusion becomes merely an echo or repetition of the original proposition, the latter being cleverly injected into the argument without being subjected to logical inspection or proof. Once admitted to the argument, the proposition, thus boldly assumed, becomes the valid basis for subsequent deduction and reasoning of a perfectly logical character. The unsupported proposition is treated as if it were really the conclusion of a previous process of syllogistic reasoning, whereas, it really is merely taken for granted or assumed without valid basis. In effect, it is really a case of attempting to prove a conclusion by itself, without the presence of supporting premises. Many public speakers commit this fallacy, often quite deliberately. Experience has shown them that usually, in the popular phrase, they can get away with it. Aaron Burr illustrated the practice in his celebrated cynical statement that, truth is that which is boldly asserted, and plausibly maintained. Bulwer makes one of his characters, an unusually clever rascal, say, whenever you are about to utter something astonishingly false, always begin with, it is an acknowledged fact, etc., or it is admitted by all, etc., or an no-thinking person denies, etc., or it is a truth undeniable, etc. The same character advises that when one is called upon for the proof of something admitting of no logical proof, he should look solemn, and, striking his breast, should say, I find it here. Another form of begging the question consists of the use of question-begging epithets, i.e., of terms or epithets suggesting or conveying unpleasant or evil associated meanings, and thus serving to arouse prejudice against, or even to damn the thing, by the use of the epithet or term which really has not been proved to apply to the thing in question at all, and of which the thing is possibly entirely innocent and free. Thus, we often hear arguments in which it is boldly asserted, without the slightest proof, be it noted, that such and such an idea is atheistic, anarchistic, unpatriotic, or immoral. The audience, bearer, or reader being asked to swallow whole without investigation or thought, the idea represented by such terms. It is a case of giving a dog a bad name and thus causing him to be stoned to death. Jevons says, we should always be on our guard against being misled by a question-begging epithets. The fallacy of circular reasoning is another variety of this general class of fallacy. Like the other varieties and forms, it is quite common, and often is quite dangerous. It consists of, attempting to prove a proposition by itself or, proving a series of propositions one by the other in a vicious circle. In its simplest form it is perpetrated by simply attempting to demonstrate or to prove a thing by means of its own definition, as for example, glass breaks because it is brittle because it breaks easily, or, We can see through glass because it is transparent. It is transparent because we can see through it. Or the girl is dumb, because she lacks the power of speech. She lacks the power of speech, because she is mute. An extension of the false principle is found in arguments or syllogisms in which the major premise is merely the unproved conclusion stated in different terms but having the same essential meaning. More complex, and consequently more dangerous, forms are as follows: my church is the true church, because it was established by God, and God could have established none other. It must have been established by God, because it is the true church, and such could have been established by none other than God. You will notice how convincing this seems at first hearing, but you will perceive that not even a single iota of proof, not even a single trace of logical argument, is offered in the whole statement. There is not even the slightest evidence, proof, or reasoning presented to show any connection between God and the establishment of truth of that particular church. Yet persons are deceived by just such false reasoning concerning many important subjects. Again, my political party is honest, because it advocates honest principles. The principles advocated by it must be honest, because they are advocated by an honest party. Once more, the Quran is infallibly true, because Allah inspired it. We know that Allah inspired it, because it is so stated in the Quran. Finally, the man is truthful, because he states so himself. Being truthful, that which he states must be truth. Circular reasoning, however, is most successfully employed in long arguments, where its detection is difficult, while in simpler form the same false reasoning would be readily detected. Frequently it is perpetrated by the use of synonyms which are suggested and assumed to express more than the original term employed in the proposition, but which really do not do so. A particularly dangerous and subtle form is that in which, as McGilvary says, there are two or more syllogisms interrelated in such a way that the conclusion of each syllogism is the premise of some other. In this way, the conclusion, or what is proved, in one syllogism is used in another syllogism as a basis of proof for a proposition which, in its turn, ultimately comes to be used as a basis of proof for the first syllogism. Read over this last statement until you thoroughly understand it. When you are able to do this, you will be prepared to give battle to the vicious circle. 3. Particular terms must not be employed as universal terms. That is to say, terms denoting only part or some, of a class of things must not be so used that they seem to denote all or the whole of that class. In order that you may thoroughly understand this rule, we shall now call your attention to the essential distinction between particular terms and universal terms expressed in the form of particular judgments and universal judgments, respectively. Particular judgments are judgments which are not general, i.e., which do not include all or the whole of the class of things to which it applies, but which, instead, include only a part, portion, or some of that class, or at least some of that class. Particular judgments are marked by the presence in them of the words some, certain, a few, many, most, or similar terms indicating that merely a part, portion, or at least some of the entire class is denoted. The terms this and these also usually denote particularity, but in exceptional cases they are sometimes employed to denote whole classes. Exactness of meaning should be ascertained when such terms are employed in forms possible of being interpreted in either way. Examples of particular judgments are as follows: some bread is biscuit, certain snakes are venomous, many men are vain, most mules are stubborn, a few Negroes are albinos, that Virginian is a Republican, this Irishman is a Protestant. When particular judgments are announced or employed, they indicate expressly that only a part or portion of a general class is involved in the statement. In them is also implied the fact that there is something left in the class. Here, however, is an important point to remember in connection with that implied something left in the class, viz., that the remaining portion so left in the class may lack the characteristics affirmed of the portion denoted by the particular term, or it may not lack them. By employing the particular term, i.e., some or its equivalents, we may mean either 1. That the remaining or other part or portion lacks the characteristic in question, or 2. That our certain knowledge of the class extends merely to that particular part or portion indicated by the particular term and involved in the particular judgment, or 3. That there remains a general doubt or possible indecision concerning the remaining part. The meaning at least some covers each and all of the above stated three respective contingencies. Therefore, This meaning should always be kept in mind when dealing with particular terms or particular judgments in deductive reasoning. Universal judgments are judgments which are general, i.e., which include the entire class of things to which it applies all the parts, portions, or individuals in that class, and not merely a part, portion, or some of the class. For instance, when we say that all men are immortal, we mean that the entire class of men possess the characteristic of mortality. Universal judgments are marked by the presence in them of the words, all, every, each, any, the whole, or similar terms denoting all the number or class, also by no, i.e., not any of the number or class. Universality either takes in the entire number or class, or else leaves out the entire number or class. The principle is the same in both cases. Examples: all men are mortal, every dog is an animal, each man was armed, any dog will eat meat, the whole family was present, or no dog is a cat, none of the family were absent, not any of the fishes have warm blood. Note the following important point: universality is also sometimes implied and tacitly indicated in certain particular terms employed for convenience to denote entire numbers or classes of things, and not merely single individual things. For instance, man is mortal. Here the term a man is employed in the universal sense and meaning of all men, and therefore becomes a universal term, the judgment becoming a universal judgment. Terms like the horse, or the cow, etc., or a horse, or a cow, meaning any horse or any cow, are also frequently employed in this way. When so employed, they become universal terms, and mark universal judgments. In such cases, the universality of the judgment is tacitly indicated, the magic words, all, each, every, any, etc., always being implied. Care must always be taken to determine whether such terms are employed in the ordinary particular sense and meaning, or, instead, in this special universal sense and meaning. Many grave fallacies arise from confusing or confounding universals and particulars in this way. Examples of fallacies arising from a violation of the rule now under consideration are as follows: white is a color, black is a color, therefore, black is white. Here color is used in its universal sense of all color, instead of its particular sense of some color. The same fallacious use of particular terms for universal terms results in the following several false conclusions: all birds are bipeds, no man is a bird, therefore, no man is a biped. Some Chinamen are highbinders, this man is a Chinaman, therefore, this man is a highbinder. Some Russians are Bolsheviks, Ivan is a Russian, therefore, Ivan is a Bolshevik. Biscuit is bread, this loaf is bread, therefore, this loaf is a biscuit. Indians are Americans, John Smith is an American, therefore, John Smith is an Indian. All thieves are human, the bishop is human, therefore, the bishop is a thief. But why multiply examples? The principle is plain. Once it is grasped, once understood, it is seen to apply to countless cases and is found to be violated in the reasoning and arguments of many persons who should, or do, know better. When used for the purpose of deceiving, it becomes sophistry or casuistry, and it is often so used, particularly by subtle suggestions and in disguised form. Here is the essential principle: terms denoting merely some must not be used to denote all. When we say that, all dogs are animals, we do not mean all animals, but rather we mean some animals, the particular mark some being implied and tacitly indicated. Fully stated, the judgment or proposition would be as follows: all dogs are some animals, i.e., that all Ethia dogs Etheri area ina existence constitute a part, portion, or some of the entire class of animals, not all or the whole of the animal class. The implication would be that also there are some animals which are not dogs, as well as that some animals which are dogs. The following diagram, with accompanying explanation, will be found helpful in fixing and keeping this principle in your mind. It is based upon the analysis of the familiar trick judgment stated as follows: biscuit is bread, but bread is not biscuit. Analyzed, this judgment means, all biscuit is some bread is all biscuit, with the implication that there is also some bread which is not any biscuit. Stated more simply, we have, all biscuit is bread but all bread is not biscuit. There is some bread which is not biscuit, but there is no biscuit which is not bread. Bread all biscuit some bread. There are three rules governing deductive reasoning which are derived from a number of more technical ones set forth in works upon formal logic. Practical logic employs these derivative rules, considering them sufficient for its general purposes. These rules are as follows. One premise, at least, must be universal. This because of the fact that, from two particular premises, no logical conclusion can be drawn. An example of the violation of this rule is found in the syllogism, some men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore, Socrates is what? The only logical conclusion possible is that Socrates may be either mortal or not mortal. He must be one or the other. He cannot be both. But this is no more than the law of opposition and law of excluded middle tell us. There is no definite conclusion possible from two particular premises. One premise, at least, must be universal. 2. If one premise is particular, the conclusion also must be particular. This because of the fact that, a universal conclusion can be drawn only from two universal premises. Examples, from the universal premise, all birds lay eggs, and the particular premise, some animals are birds, we may logically deduce merely the particular conclusion that, some animals lay eggs, but we cannot logically deduce the universal conclusion that, all animals lay eggs. But, on the other hand, from the following two universal premises, all finches are birds, all sparrows are finches, we may logically deduce the universal conclusion that, all sparrows are birds. 3. The conclusion must contain nothing that is not involved in the premises. This, because, as the conclusion is necessarily made up of the material of the two premises, any addition to this material would be an unwarranted and illogical introduction or dragging in of foreign matter or extra material which, in the words of Puaba, have nothing to do with the case. Such foreign matter, thus dragged into the case, is, as the lawyers say, incompetent, immaterial, irrelevant, and impertinent. Yet this fallacy, often deliberately employed as specious sophistry, is frequently perpetrated, and often succeeds in accomplishing its purpose. The fallacy consists in the statement of irrelevant conclusions. In one of its phases, the irrelevant conclusion is caused by the employment of certain terms as universal terms in the conclusion, while in the premises they were used as particular terms. We have already considered this form of the fallacy. The second phase consists of the introduction into the conclusion of judgments entirely foreign and alien to the issue, and which are not in any way logically involved in the premises. This last mentioned form is sometimes known as non sequitur, meaning, it does not follow. Non sequitur is marked by the introduction or dragging in of points say not at issue in an argument or course of reasoning, i.e., points having nothing at all to do with the case under consideration, or points having no possible logical relation to the original premises. Examples follow. All men are rational, Socrates is a man, therefore, Socrates is truly noble. Episcopacy is of scriptural origin. The Church of England is an episcopal church, therefore, the Church of England should be supported by tithes. The Church is a good institution. The state is a good institution, therefore, the Church and the state should be united. The evidence shows that John Smith is a liar. All murderers are liars, therefore, John Smith should be hanged. This place is called Stony Stratford. I was never so bitten by fleas in my life as here, therefore, rightly is this place called Stony Stratford. More cleverly disguised forms of this fallacy, yet involving the same essential principle, pass muster every day in argument, debate, and serious discussion. Remember the adage, if it does not follow logically from the premises, it is foreign to the issue. A general fallacy. There is another fallacy frequently appearing in reasoning and argument, but one which is not referred to in the specific rules of logical reasoning. We wish to direct your attention to it. It is known as the fallacy of prejudice. It is quite common, and often quite dangerous. You should give it careful consideration and honest thought. Fallacy of prejudice. By prejudice is meant prejudgment, unwarranted and unreasonable predilection for or objection to anything, especially an opinion or leaning favorable or adverse to anything, without just grounds, or before sufficient knowledge. The common forms of prejudiced judgment are as follows. 1. Prejudice in favor of propositions agreeing with our feelings, emotions, or general likes, or against propositions running contrary to our feelings, emotions, or likes. 2. Prejudices in favor of propositions advanced by persons favorably regarded or liked by us, or against propositions advanced by persons unfavorably regarded or disliked by us. 3. Prejudice in favor of opinions at present held and previously stated by us, or against opinions at present opposed. and previously disputed by us. Let us consider briefly each of these three forms. A. It is quite difficult to divorce our judgments from our feelings. Our likes, loves and hates tend to prejudice our judgments, and to give us a mental slant in the direction of the like and against the dislike. Bernard Shaw tells us that most of our reasoning consists of either trying to excuse or justify our previous judgments and actions caused by our states of feeling, or else of trying to invent excuses for present or future judgments or actions likewise so caused. Feeling and emotion resemble the tinted glass which colors the rays of the sun which pass through it. Everything we consider is apt to be seen colored in the tints and shades which our feelings have imparted to it. You should ever be on your guard against the interposition of the colored screen between your reasoning faculties and the objects or subjects of logical thought. Strive ever to secure the clear, unimpeded passage of the white light of pure reason. Let it shine upon the objects of your thought. B. We find it difficult to give the proper value to an opinion, proposition or judgment announced by a person or persons disliked by us. Likewise, we find it quite easy to place an exaggerated value upon opinions, propositions or judgments announced by those whom we like. Here, once more, feeling seeks to usurp the office of reason. Truth is truth, by whomsoever stated, and untruth is none the less untruth even when stated by an estimable person, or one very dear to us. A thing is, or is not, so, without regard to our opinion of, or our feelings toward, the person making one or the other of these necessary judgments. It is our business to find out which is which, by reason alone, bidding feeling to step aside and to keep its thumb off the scale. Judgments should stand on their own feet. The crutches of feeling are not required. They are a sign of weakness on the part of reason. C. It is characteristic of the human mind to incline to support even the weakest opinion or judgment already lodged in it, and to defend such against the attacks of even the strongest truths and reasons. Even when the conflict is confined to one's own mind, and no other person is involved in it, this remains true. Even though the preconceived opinion or judgment may have been based originally upon insufficient and unstable grounds of reasoning, the slightest proof and the weakest evidence, nevertheless it often requires the very strongest evidence and proof, the most positive reasoning and most certain logic to cause us to budge an inch from our position. We have said to ourselves that the thing was so. We have expressed the same opinion to others, and to change is akin to backing down. The thing may be a poor thing, but it is our very own. We hate to part with it. To separate it from us too strongly suggests an amputation or the removal of a mental appendix. It is quite right and proper to hold fast to our opinion, but we should be sure that the latter is well grounded in fact, and well supported by logical reasoning. We should endeavor to keep at least a fairly open mind, even though we keep a keen-eyed sturdy watchman at the gate.